Greetings and welcome to the Warhammer 40,000 Kill Team video, where today I'm going over my scoring guide for Kill Team, where I go through the most optimal way for you to score and win your games. But before we get into things, please remember to like and subscribe as well as comment. Let me know what you thought of today's video if you found it useful and helpful. And remember, I've got a Discord you can check out in the episode description below, an affiliate link at Element Games, and an affiliate link and discount code at Crossfire Games, as well as a Patreon if you want to give me some more support. But yeah, this is one of my, going back to guides, because currently, we're waiting for the balanced data slate. The one thing that can't change for now is the core rules. So I'm going over my scoring guide, which is basically what I'm going to do in this video is give you the guide for the most optimal way to score and win your games via effectively with the primary, effectively with the crit op, the tac ops, kind of mentioning the kill op, and then basically what to pick as your primary, because that's a lot of confusion I get. And even when I see in games people not making suboptimal, not making incorrect, just making suboptimal decisions when it comes to how you score, because scoring is more diverse now when we get into the new edition of Kill Team. But let's get on with the video. So starting off, as I said, we've got our 3 new ways to score in Kill Team with this new edition. So you've got the crit op, which is the main mission, the tac op, which is your secondary, and then the kill op, which is killing. And then you've got the primary, which you select during turning point 1 in the strategy phase, where you get a number of extra points based on which one you focus on. So let's start off with the kill op, because this is the most easy to talk about. The kill op is, how do you describe it? Completely out of your control. If you're ever thinking of something to focus on, the kill op is something I highly recommend you don't. Now, when it comes to the kill op, you have the kill grade tally, and you can score a maximum of 5 points from the tally, but then you get 1 more point if at the end of the game, your kill grade is higher than your opponent's kill grade. And the only way to get the full 5 points is if you've wiped out your opponent, and then you get an extra point if your kill op is higher. So if you've wiped out your opponent and you have they haven't done the same to you, you will get 6 points. But on the other hand, if you've somehow both wiped yourselves out, then you both get 5 points. And I've actually seen it happen once, so it's not impossible, and it happened in a tournament. So the main problem is you can't really control how you do the kill op, because you're either going to predict your opponent's going to come to you, they're going to be in situations where you can kill them, and also you're relying on your dice going your way all the time, because the dice are still a random and fickle thing. Just ask Nuffle. But it's generally outside of your control. Even if you can ensure and guarantee all those dices with either severe, dice fixing, punishing, all that kind of stuff, the main issue is if your opponent doesn't engage too much and doesn't run towards you, or starts running away when they're realizing they're behind or tied on the kill op, you're not really going to max it. And the kill op is basically the most disruptible form of option you can choose for scoring. The way I approach the kill op is just whatever happens, happens, right? I've experimented picking the kill op as my primary once or twice, and I just realized I should have just focused on something else instead. Because as I said, when you roll badly, your kill op messes up, even if you are in the right position. And then I've also had opponents, when I'm ahead on the kill op or we're tied, and then they just realized, oh, he's going to try and wipe me for the kill op, I'll just run away. And the problem is, everyone I've talked to about the kill op who select it regularly as their primary go like, oh yeah, some of the time it doesn't work out, but it would have been really great here or worked really well here. And even, I've chatted with friends and other players where they go like, oh, I should have picked the kill op as my primary because I was going to wipe you out. And I was like, no, the kill op is like the most, if I did that, it would have worked, because when you're looking back, you see where all these dice rolls and all that killing would have happened. So that's why you think it is so good. And I'm not saying it's bad, and I'm not saying never focus on the kill op. It is a really good tool to surprise your opponent, because a lot of people won't expect it. But when you're trying to be consistent in events and in your games, the kill op is the least reliable scoring method you could pick. And my best advice is always try to play the kill op so that you're just at least 1 kill grade higher than your opponent. Don't focus on trying to wipe out your opponent, because then you can lead into situations where you run away on the kill op, but then sacrifice your tac op and crit op. But the kill op is still very important, And what I use it to do is that tie-breaking method. Because remember, as long as your kill op is, well, your kill grade is 1 higher than your opponent, that's a 2-point swing to yourself. And when you're trying to maintain the kill op, what I like to do is, if it's a very close game, I'll try and make sure I go 1 ahead of the kill op. But also, if I'm already 1 ahead of the kill op, there'll be situations where I can go, all right, I can push through it and maybe go like another kill grade higher, which will give me a free VP swing. Or I can just play it safe, hang back, you know, focus on the crit op, because if I do this push and then my dice rolls fail, then my opponent can like catch me up on the crit op, tac op, and maybe even out on the kill op with my overextension. So don't not focus on the kill op. I use it as a stepping stone to try and either stay neck and neck or slightly ahead of my opponent and use that to get a very advantageous lead, because the kill op is still really important. It's just the problem is a lot of people focus too much on maxing it, which is very unreliable. Going ahead on it, that's great, but I would never really recommend picking it as your primary or your main way to score. Now we come on to the crit op. The crit op is the mission. So currently we have 9 different missions. We have a lot of missions, and I'll quickly go through them. So we have secure, you know, number 1, which is basically sticky points. You secure them, run away. You don't have to control them after that, but then your opponent can flip them back. Loot, where you have to like loot them each turning point. Transmission, which is like secure-ish, but you have to turn on the objectives you want to score every turning point. Then you've got upload, which is kind of a gambling mission of loot. Then you've got intel, which is like loot, but then you can kind of run away with what you've scored. Then you've got extraction, which is just not fun, but it is basically who can either pick the objectives up the earliest or the latest. Then you've got sabotage, which is also not a great mission, which is just about running and nuking your opponent's objective. Power surge, which is one of the more balanced missions in terms of trying to find the hot objective, but not necessarily focusing on the surge objective. And then you've got coordinates, which is a weird version of loot. But the main thing is you have 9 different crit ops. And the crit ops should be something you focus on a lot. And it's actually, oddly, something I've noticed even like last edition. So last edition, people wouldn't focus too much on the primary. You could go up to 16 on the main mission victory points, and people wouldn't generally focus on that. They'd still focus primarily on their tac ops. And I'm kind of seeing the same thing in the new edition. People aren't really focusing on the mission as much. Well, the crit op. I've played several games where my opponent has kind of railroaded onto their tac ops because they can reliably score their tac ops, but generally miss that they're quite heavily behind on the crit op to the point where they score 1 or no victory points on it at least every turning point. And if you think about it, that's at least a free victory point swing to your opponent. So the important thing to remember with the crit op, you can only ever score a maximum of 6 victory points from it, but only some missions cap you at scoring 2 victory points a turn. Some missions allow you to score all your victory points in one single turning point. For example, extraction, you could theoretically score all 6 victory points from it in turning point 5. Turning point 3, sorry. So it's not like you can just capped at 2, and I think that's what throws people off. Now, that is a minority. Most objectives for the crit op are score 2 VP a turn. Well, you can score up to 3 VP a turn, but maximum 2 VP. So it's usually your opponent scoring 2 and then you scoring 1 or vice versa. But you can have situations where you score 2 victory points and your opponent scores 0. For example, you have secure. It's the most simple one to use as an example. If you secure your point and secure the middle point and your opponent doesn't secure an objective, you just get 2 flat victory points. And as I said, I've played several missions where my opponent tries to either run forward with the tac op and crit op, but then they kind of forget about the tac op and kill op, and then forget about the crit op, which lets them go quite severely behind. And even, for example, in my games in LVO, where my opponent went ahead on the tac op, they actually severely compromised the crit op, while I was able to still score okay on the tac op and tie or slightly go ahead on the crit op. On the kill op. So what should you do with your crit op? You should really focus on it. I know it seems counterintuitive, but I think because people look at the crit op, tac op, and kill op and see that there's 6 victory points for each, people generally ignore the crit op or not prioritize it as much. And there's a lot of missions which can catch you out. For example, with secure, if you run and flip your opponent's one, suddenly they go down to 1 or even no victory points. Or you have interesting ones like transmission, where you have to turn on an objective each turning point to score it. But if only one objective is active and you're controlling it, you get 2 victory points because you control a transmitting objective, and you control the most objectives. So it does depend on the mission, and some teams can't play all the missions. My advice is always play the Crit Op, and the Crit Op is actually a really solid pick for the primary. A lot of teams can't pick the best Tac Ops, which I'll get into in a moment, but if you don't have an archetype or matchup that's great for the Tac Op, I actually highly recommend the Crit Op. So these are mainly factions with security and seek and destroy, because those Crit Ops, those Tac Op archetypes are quite difficult to max, where with the Crit Op, remember when you're trying to max the primary, you only need to score a minimum of 5 points to get 3 points on the primary, because the primary is half of your total victory points from that chosen Crit Op, Tac Op, or Kill Op, halved rounding up. So personally, if I'm in a situation where I know my opponent can either deny my Tac Op or I can't reliably score my Tac Op, I pick the Crit Op, because the Crit Op is something very easy for you to control in most scenarios, especially if you're playing elite Space Marine teams or even teams with good board control, because the Crit Op is very reliable. All you have to do is usually sit on an objective or do a mission action or both, and that doesn't involve any dice, it just involves you positioning well, which is very doable and quite reliable, especially if you out-activate your opponent. So for example, on, let's use Secure again, my opponent has popped their point, and then I've got the middle point, and then I've got my own objective. Last activation, I could actually, if I've got a way to get more APL onto their own point, either via like they haven't left enough people there, I'm super mobile, or I've, murdered everyone on that objective, I can then last activation, run onto that, flip it, so then I score 3 victory points going down to 2, but my opponent importantly scores 0. Now on the flip side, you have loot. So let's say I win initiative and I take it as loot. I am already contesting the middle, but I quickly run and like overwhelm their left side objective and loot it. So then I loot their middle, I loot their own objective. They try and fight to contest the second, and then second activation, I move. So I am sacrificing potentially the Kill Op advantage, but not only am I going 2 points up on the Crit Op, my opponent is likely scoring no points. And the Crit Op is generally the archetype where you can actually force your opponent into scoring 0 victory points. So if you do that for 1 turn, that's a 2 VP swing. And if you do it for 2 turns, that's a 4 VP swing. Now, if you can do it for 3 turning points, so turning point 2, 3, and 4, you've probably already won. But I've had a lot of games where my opponent has been like either ahead or slightly ahead on the Kill Op, doing well on the Tac Op, but on the Crit Op, they've only scored like 1 or 2, and I'm on my way to score 6. So this is where it becomes really important. And it's something I only learned really last edition when I was talking to my friend Bart from London, who basically his main game plan quickly evolved into focusing on the Crit Op, because you would get maximum 16 victory points where your Tac Op would only give 6. And the key thing about this new edition of Kill Team is objective scoring and denial, which you can do pretty well with a lot of the Crit Ops. Now, once again, I will come with the caveat, some Crit Ops are just horrible. Like Sabotage, some teams will absolutely destroy you because they can quickly have abilities that can override controlling objectives, run onto your objective, turn that off, and then just sit on the mid and get 2 victory points a turning point. But in most general schemes of things, you can control the Crit Op very well, which is why I think it's a great choice for the primary, as well as always focusing on. People always talk about the Kill Op and the Tac Op, but the Crit Op is something I see ignored, not all the time, but quite heavily. And for me, it's one of the biggest scoring avenues, because as I said, while with the Kill Op, you can generally get a 2-point swing over your opponent, with the Crit Op, you can also get a 2-point swing, and sometimes even a 3-point swing, because that key turn, you go 2 victory points and your opponent goes 0. If they then score 1 victory point the next turning point, and then 1 victory point again, you're already ahead by 4 victory points, which is incredibly huge with the smaller metrics for scoring we have in Kill Team, which is why I think the Crit Op is great. And obviously you need to focus on the mission to win, but it seems a lot of people don't. So I highly recommend the Crit Op. Now we go into the Tac Ops. This is where I will kind of go through every archetype and talk through them. Tac Ops are generally, unfortunately, the most reliable way to score and select your primary. If you haven't, like, basically most people will just select Tac Op as their primary, which is fair. You don't have to care about the mission, what Crit Op we're playing, or killing. You can just go like, I'm going to consistently score that. And there are some teams that score these Tac Ops incredibly reliably, which isn't a bad thing at all. But I'll get through that as I go through them archetype by archetype. So starting off with Seek and Destroy, you've got Overrun, Storm Objectives, and Champion. And personally, my favorite two out of these are Overrun and Champion. The problem with Seek and Destroy, however, it's heavily geared towards elite kill teams, as well as generally fighting into horde kill teams, which means a lot of horde teams or mid-range teams, so teams that basically are in between elite and horde teams, don't really get much out of Seek and Destroy. So if you do have it as an archetype in one of those teams, it can feel a bit useless. So let's go on with my favorite, which is Overrun. So you have to remember when it comes to Tac Ops, they have a reveal, and some is in the strategy phase, some is when you score them. So Overrun, reveal when you first score from this Tac Op, and the victory point is once per turning point after the first. If an enemy operative is incapacitated by a friendly operative and you're wholly within their territory, when it does so, you score a victory point. And then at the end of the turning point, if the total APL stats of friendly operatives that fulfilled the above condition and are still wholly within your opponent's victory territory are 3 APL or more, you score 1 VP. So obviously, elite kill teams scored this very easily because they are 3 APL. But if you have 2 or more operatives that are 2 APL that can trigger this and both survive, you get another Tac Op point. Now, generally, this is great into horde teams or even like mid-range teams if you're an elite player, because you just go like, you can reliably get 1 marine in, get a single or double kill in, trigger that, especially if you've controlled that sector of the board, and then you max Overrun, especially if you do it as your last activation. Horde teams can do it. The issue is you need people to survive. Even if you've got a lone like Harlequin, it's only 8 wounds, and if that gets wiped out, you're kind of rough. So great for elites, not great for everyone else. And even then, it can be good into the elite mirror, but once again, you have to survive, which is really dicey. Then you've got Storm Objectives. So at the end of each friendly operative's activation, if it controls an objective marker that enemy controlled at the start of that activation or is wholly within your opponent's territory, and that objective marker is not contested by enemy operatives, that objective marker is stormed by friendly operatives this turning point. And then once per turning point after the first, if an objective marker is stormed by friendly operatives this turn, you get a victory point. And at the end of each turning point after the first, if you control an objective marker that was stormed by friendly operatives this turning point, you get another victory point. So the only problem with storm objectives is if your opponent's not on the central objective, you can only really score it if you're going after their home objective, which that isn't great, and it's just not a really good Tac Op to pick. So maybe there's some Gallo Dark maps where this is quite useful, and maybe even on Beta Decima. But this is a Tac Op I would just wholly avoid. Then we've got Champion, which is you reveal when you select your champion, and you select it as a strategic gambit. And then in each of your turning points after the first, whenever your champion incapacitates an enemy operative, you score 1 VP or 2 VP if that had a wound stat of 12 or more, to a maximum of 2 VP per turning point. So this is once again amazing for elites, but also amazing for elites into elites. So if you're running an elite kill team, this is really good into other elite kill teams, because generally an elite can 1v1 each other. And I like taking it now in the elite matchup, because most of the time you will find people in turning point 2 giving initiative to yourself. But I found when I'm running champion, they give me initiative and I go, okay, last activation in the strategy phase, I reveal my champion. And then they go, oh, and my champion just charges and kills your point. And so you get +1 command point, I get +2 victory points. Now, champion is quite dicey, and obviously you can run it as an elite into hordes, because if you can charge and get double kills, that's great, but it's more dicey. And the other issue is it is a strategic gambit, so you have to remember to trigger it. And if your opponent starts, deciding to take the initiative, it becomes really a big gamble, because then you have to hope your champion is within range and also survives. And I would never take champion into Nemesis Claw, because Nemesis Claw with their Vox Scream basically stop you from scoring champion. But however, if you are Nemesis Claw, you can reliably score champion thanks to Vox Scream. So champion, great into elites as elites, and overrun is great as an elite into any team you outnumber. Storm objectives, just never take. Seek and Destroy overall is a very dicey Tac Op archetype, and I find if you are playing Seek and Destroy, a lot of the time it can be covered by the kill op. But as I said, elite Space Marine teams like consistently score Seek and Destroy well. But in general, if you've got another archetype, I would recommend that because you can kind of get a similar feel from Seek and Destroy with the kill op. Going into security, this is quite dependable depending on the board and the team. Generally better for horde teams. So you've got Contain, reveal this when you first score victory points from this. At the end of each turning point after the first, if there are no enemy objectives wholly within your territory, score 1 VP, and if there are no enemy objectives within 6 inches of your drop zone, score 1 VP. So security used to be the best at the start of the game, then it's the worst. Now it flips around because if you're a good player, you kind of know how to play around it, but it's not the easiest thing to deny. It's great into elite mirrors, especially if you know you're going last, because you can protect your Contain as well as deny your opponents, because last activation, if you just reposition and dash to end up within 6 inches of their drop zone, your opponent scores 0 victory points. And that's the biggest thing. Because they just have to get within 6 of your drop zone, this Tac Op becomes very easy to deny. And it's actually really good for horde teams that outnumber the opponent, because you have so many activations, you know, ahead of the opponent. If you have like a 12 operative team versus 6 operative team, if your opponent, unless they push forward with their whole kill team, if they just send 1 or 2 operatives, you have more than enough activations to deny and kill this. So, you know, Contain oddly becomes better in the elite matchup or when you heavily out-activate your opponent. Contain, I find, is actually the best on Gallo Dark, because Gallo Dark is where it's much harder to move into your opponent's territory safely, generally because they're currently, if you're playing the Games Workshop maps, they're just huge open rooms. So it can be quite risky to deny Contain. I still think it's a solid Tac Op, but not the best. Then you've got Take Ground, so you reveal it when you first score victory points. So at the end of each turning point after the first, if you're in Vocus, if you control any stronghold terrain features within your opponent's territory, you score 2 VP, and for each ruin, large or small terrain feature that you control within your opponent's territory, you get another victory point. So effectively, you don't have to be wholly within, it just has to be slightly within, which is a change from last edition. But then you in Killzone Gallo Dark, for each access point that's on the center line or within your opponent's territory that you control, you score 1 VP. And then for any other kill zone and any other kill zone, for each terrain feature with heavy terrain in your opponent's territory that for any optics control, you score another victory point. And you can score a maximum of 2 VP per turning point, and an operative contests a stronghold feature there inside and are wholly within, and contests all other terrain features in their control range, all while underneath their vantage. I actually think Take Ground is probably the best archetype Tac Op for security. It's really good on most of the Vocus kill zones, especially when there is an objective overlapping, because as I said, it doesn't have to be wholly within, it just has to have a little smidge of that terrain within your opponent's territory and it counts as within. And you just have to be inside, so you can even be on the top of the vantage in Vocus and score that. It's really good on Gallo Dark for maps where you have a lot of doors near the center line, because if you're controlling a corner, you can control 2 doors with 1 operative and effectively get 2 victory points then. And this is actually really good on Beta Decima, because once again, if gantries are touching, they count as 1 big terrain feature, and usually you have a lot of gantries on the board, so this can be very easy to score. Take Ground is the most consistent Tac Op for security, and I'd highly recommend it if you're running security. And then finally you have Secure Center, which is the same scoring condition, and you can score it if the total APL stat within 3 of the center is higher than your opponent's, and the total APL stat of operatives on the center line. So Secure Center is like the middle ground of Take Ground and Contain. It's actually quite good into the elite matchup, but generally you take it into teams you outnumber, because firstly you can throw more operatives onto the middle, and then also you can out-activate and have like 1 guy run into the open on the center line. Now this depends on the map, but always if you're running Secure Center, I would generally pick it. You have 2 frames of mind. You either pick Secure Center on an open objective in terms of part of the board that's very open. So if your opponent is trying to contest it, they have to run into the open, which is effectively sacking you a free point. or an objective on the middle. So you can score that objective on the middle and score your Tac Op. So that comes down to you, but I've had great success within the Elite Mirror, as well as in maps where I couldn't really reliably score Take Ground and Contain wasn't an option. Secure Center is a good middle ground. And unfortunately with Secure Center, it's going to come down to your experience with your kill team and the maps, because it can be very difficult and easy, especially if you play Brave and run into the open and just go, well, I'm going to win initiative next turning point. I hope it's going to happen. In general, I'd go Take Ground, take down Secure Center, then Contain. Now we come into Infiltration. So when you're trying to score Infiltration, unfortunately, it does dedicate you away from the Crit Op and Kill Op. Because the problem is, if you're looking at security, you can generally score it while you're playing the mission, because a lot of the conditions for security overlap with the Crit Op. Seek and Destroy overlaps heavily with the Kill Op, which is great. Infiltration doesn't overlap with anyone. And the problem with Infiltration as a whole, it's very kill team dependent. And the best reason why is surveillance. So surveillance is the first time you have done this action, it's revealed. So it's one action point, and it's when you have gathered surveillance. You cannot perform this action while you have an engaged order, and you must be wholly within your opponent's territory, and there must be an enemy operative that's a valid target to it. And you can't perform this during the first turning point while within control range. So then once after the first turning point, if you do the surveillance action, you get a victory point. And then at the end of each turning point after the first, if the friendly operative that performed the surveillance action has a kill zone or has a conceal order and is still in the kill zone, you can score another victory point. Generally, I would only take surveillance if you heavily outnumber the opponent, because you, once again, last activation can just reposition and dash on conceal with +1 APL and then gather surveillance with someone. The important thing here is to remember the term valid target. So a valid target is someone with an engage order or someone with a conceal order that isn't within control range of cover. Oddly, you can use it to check valid targets for people trapped in close combat, because they're still a valid target. And once you just run up within 2 inches of someone, which also negates them. As I said, if you heavily outnumber your opponent, this is great. Like, this is quite clutch on Blooded if you heavily outnumber your opponent. But there are specific teams that score this Tac Op super easily. Now it's 2 operatives, really. Well, 3 operatives. So the first one is the Commando Grot, because he hook shots over to the Vocus highest vantage in your territory, and then just picks anyone he likes for the rest of the game and gets 6 victory points. Then you have the same with Mandrakes, who teleport up to the highest vantage, see you, and then get 6 victory points. And now you can have it with Ratlings, where their hookshot guy gets to the highest point in Vocus and gets 2 victory points. Now that is the easiest way to do it, but as I said, if you outnumber your opponent or get to sides they can't reach, the Commando Grot is great for this. For example, on Gallodark, hookshotting down to your opponent's opposite side of their kill zone, their drop zone, and then seeing everyone lined up behind the doors and going, you, I gather you. So surveillance is only really good if your kill team can abuse it, or if you heavily outnumber your opponent, because you're going to have someone who doesn't commit to the mission whatsoever or interact, and someone you can throw away, which is generally a hoardy kind of thing. Then you have Implant, which is the best worst Tac Op ever. So whenever a friendly operative is fighting, when you resolve an attack dice, you can implant the enemy operative instead of striking or blocking them. And whenever a friendly operative is shooting an enemy operative within 6, you can do the same. Each operative can only be implanted once and cannot be implanted during the first turning point. Once per turning point, if you implant an enemy operative, you score 1 VP, and at the end of each turning point after the first, if any implanted enemy operatives are in the kill zone, you score 1 VP. So the main problem you may see with Implant is you're either relying on heavily overkilling your opponent so you can just throw away a victory point, well, an attack dice, or you're letting your opponent live, right? The good thing I will say about Implant is at the end of each turning point, if you, let's say, implant someone turning point 2, and then they live till the end of the game, all you need to do is implant someone different every other turning point, because they'll keep giving you a victory point. So that's the good part. The main problem I find with Implant is people forget you can't reveal it when you're retaliating. So if someone charges you and then fights you, you can't implant, because you can only implant when you're fighting. So that's a key thing to remember. And also, I've had people charge me, implant me, and then die. So it's not exactly great because, especially with the addition of the Kill Op now, if you run Implant and just run a guy into me to die, you help me go ahead on the Kill Op, which is not really good, especially if I can, you know, match or max my Tac Op as well. It's just kind of like technically keeping up. Now, the shooting option is nice, and I have seen it happen. I think the best use of Infiltration for shooting is on attacks that do like 1 or 0 damage, where you're like, I don't really think it will kill. I've seen it great with like the Commando Comms Boy, because his gun is 0, 6 dice. All he wants to do is just stun you. But, well, no, it's 1 damage now. But basically, yeah, a 0 attack or 1 attack damage, you just go like, I've got 4 hits, I'll implant you for 1 and then chip you away with this. So that's a good pick. And it's a great pick if you think you're just going to lose a lot of people, but it's not the best. And then you've got Wiretap. Wiretap is just bad. I won't go through Wiretap because it relies your opponent just sitting on objectives, which is very strange. Like, it's just bad. It's the worst Tac Op in the game. You never run Wiretap. So if you're running Infiltration or you have it as an archetype, generally it's Gather Surveillance and you're maxing Gather Surveillance. You can max Implant, and Implant you will max, but you're going to help your opponent go ahead on the Kill Op. I've literally had people max Implant against me, but they've given because they've left that operative to live, it then lets me go ahead on the Crit Op and Kill Op, which I don't think is worth it. So Implant, you know, it's okay, but Surveillance is the best. But that's why Infiltration isn't the best archetype when it comes to scoring, unless your kill team can reliably abuse the game to score it, such as with Mandrakes and Commandos. Then finally we come to Recon. Recon is the best archetype again. Recon can never not be the best archetype. So for Recon, you've got Confirm Kill. Reveal the first time an enemy operative is incapacitated. Whenever an enemy operative is incapacitated, you drop a marker and they're within their control range. And if you could control it at the end of the turn, you get 1 victory point if they had 11 wounds or less. And you get 2 victory points instead if they had 12 wounds or more from that single token. And you can control more than 1 token per turning point. So Confirm Kill is amazing into elites. The biggest problem I found with Confirm Kill, this comes more when you go to the higher echelons of tournament play, because people will actually be quite dicey turning point 2 in terms of not always fully committing. You can find yourself into situations, especially on Gallowdark, where there are no kills turning point 2, and then you score nothing for Confirm Kill. But on the flip side, if you can somehow get kills turning point 1, they will still drop Confirm Kill markers, you just won't be able to score them. And the good thing about Confirm Kill, every time you kill someone, they leave markers everywhere. So you don't have to control them immediately. You can now start planning out where you're going to score. But if you're into like close range or melee teams that are going to get close to you, Confirm Kill is a really good pick because they die, they drop, and then you can choose to score then. Or what you can do at the end of the turning point, let's say you're in a risky position where you've got 2 Confirm Kill markers that you're currently controlling, and then you've got 2 that are safe in your own territory. Always score the risky ones first, because then you can reliably go, I can swarm and score these ones later. But Confirm Kill is great into any kill team with 12 or more wounds. It's just not as reliable into more open and spaced out kill zones, such as some Volcus maps, as well as Gallowdark. But if you're into elite, like melee kill teams, always take Confirm Kill. It's so good. It's a seek and destroy Tac Op that for some reason is in Recon. Then we have Recover Items, which is a solid pick as well. At the start of the setup operative step before equipment is set up, you place 3 different markers. So your opponent places 1 on the center line and 1 within 2 inches of your territory, and then you place 1 within 6 inches of your territory. You can perform the pickup marker on them after the first turning point. And at the end of the 4th turning point, for each mission marker that you've done the pickup marker and control, you get 2 victory points. So you already know where everything is. And it can be quite action point intensive, but I really like Recover Items. A lot of people don't because they're like, your opponent knows where it is. But remember, you control where the one that has to be within 6. So you can put it in the open and go, I'm going to score this last turning point. A key thing to remember with Recover Items, they can be put on Vantage. They can. You can put them on the top of Vantage as long as they meet the criteria of where they have to be within of the kill zone of the center line. So if your opponent is canny, they can put them on Vantages, but also you can as well if you're very fast and teleporty. But I really like Recover Items because you know where to stage at the end. Now, it is difficult because your opponent does pick place where the other two go, but I think that's fine because one has to be on the center line and the other one has to be within 2 inches of the center line. And if you look at all the maps, unless it's Gallowdark, it's very difficult to make that unreliable for you to get. Sure, you may be in the open, but especially if you outnumber your opponent, you can easily do that. So I'm a big fan. If you're a good planner, recover items is great. It's like really good for teams like novitiates who want to stage up because now you know where you can safely go to trigger your damage reduction. But I like recover items. And then we've got plant beacons, which is the best Tac Op archetype. Well, best Tac Op. So for 1 action point, you place one of your beacons, and to place your mission markers, they have to be within your operative's control range, more than 4 inches from your drop zone, more than 6 inches from other markers, and with no part underneath a vantage point. You get 1 victory point for putting one in your territory and another for doing it to your opponent. This is so easy, especially it is 6 action points if you think about it. It's quite intensive, but what's really good is you, especially if you outnumber your opponent or you think your opponent's going to be quite standoffish, you just reliably score this. Because the trick is, from unfortunately the wording, when you're placing it in your opponent's kill zone, you just have to be within just slightly under an inch of the center line, because you just need to drop the marker within control range of yourself. So if you're like just near the center line in your own territory, you can drop it in your opponent's territory and score plant beacons and easily get 2 victory points from that. Especially when you do it your last activation turning point 2, it means once your opponent now starts pressuring you, you can then quickly kill and then score again. The other issue is you really need to remember they have to be 6 inches apart from other beacons, because I've had a lot of opponents not realize this and either like checkmate themselves or unintentionally cheat. So it's very easy to mess yourself up with the placement, but is the most consistent Tac Op in the game. And if you were going to pick your primary, always pick plant beacons. It's so reliable. Why does this exist? But once again, going through Recon, plant beacons is the best. Then we'd go confirm kill, like depending on your opponent, with recover items being a solid pick as well. Recon is the best archetype, and I think Recon and either Infiltration or Security are the best combinations to have, because you have the most reliability to pick from and just murder your opponent with from scoring. So finally, we come to what should you select as your primary? Well, you probably know if you've watched the whole video, but once again, the key thing about the primary, it's scored. You select your primary at the first turning point during the strategy phase, because the thing is, you can just automatically pick it, but the game state does change. Your opponent's deployment may change stuff, what you may go for. But the key thing is, it's one of the crit op, kill op, or Tac Op halved, rounded up. So the most you can score for your primary is 3, minimum is 0. And unfortunately, as I said, Tac Ops, you just generally pick the Tac Ops. But if, as I said, if you don't have a reliable Tac Op archetype you can max, such as, for example, you would Security and Seek and Destroy, or Seek and Destroy and Infiltration, and you're not really a big hoardy team or don't have teleporty movie tricks, then I would go with the Crit Op. The Crit Op is a great choice for your primary, because the Tac Op you can generally reliably score, and when you're trying to max your primary, you're trying to go for minimum 5 points. You don't have to go for 6. Obviously 6 is ideal, but 5 will still give you the max primary points of 3. So obviously you can do that with your Tac Op, but you can do that quite reliably with the Crit Op. Even in missions where you can only like pop a point once per turning point, if you go 2, 2, then 1, that gives you 5 on the Crit Op, which will give you 3 on the primary. So that's still a solid pick, and you know, that's great. And then you've got the Kill Op. Only pick the Kill Op if you like to live dangerously. Once again, the Kill Op is incredibly random and very easy for your opponent to deny. You can have it denied for yourself by your dice, by just going, nah, not feeling it today. Or your opponent just going, ooh, we're tied on the Kill Op. I'm just going to run away. I've had people do that, and it can be very successful if you can't catch them up. So it can suddenly make your Kill Op not score that reliably. And to get 3 points from the primary on the Kill Op, you have to be on kill grade 4, and your opponent has to be on kill grade 3 or less for you to go to 5 victory points, which would halve up into 3 primary, which is very inconsistent. And as I said, currently the game for scoring, at least in tournaments, is all about consistency, and you get the most consistency out of the Crit Op and Tac Op, and not so much Kill Op. So primary is still incredibly important, and it can actually swing games quite heavily. I've had games where I've picked bad Tac Ops, or I picked Tac Ops and not scored them well enough. And then even though they were consistent, I picked them as the primary, when in reflection, and matter of fact, I should have gone with the Crit Op, which would have given me, even though I would have only gotten like a max of 5, that would have given me the full free primary. So it's very difficult, and it gets more sense the more you play. But especially if you're running Recon, Recon is almost a max 6 victory points, which goes into 9 victory points with your primary. And then if you're a team that easily maxes surveillance, then that's another 9 victory points. So it's very important what you pick. And while the kill op, you know, potentially, if you've scored 6 points on the kill op and your opponent scored 3, and then you get 3 on the primary, that's amazing. But if you remove the primary from that factor, if you're scoring 6 on the kill op, you've probably won the game anyway. And that just turns into the kill op just being a win more. Whereas the crit op and tac op being your primary are how you actually reliably win games and break usually deadlocks. So look, it is fun. I'm not going to deny just going like the boss move of maxing the crit op, the kill op, and then going primary kill op and just looking at your opponent and just like, what's happened? It's hilarious, but remember, it's not consistent, and unfortunately consistency is the way to success. So overall, hopefully this video helped. It's a bit of a long guide, but I wanted to be thorough. It's something I've wanted to talk about for a while. You know, we're still waiting for the balanced data slate, and this is something I've been improving since I've been playing last edition, and it's something that's surprisingly gets me very far in games. As I said, focusing on the crit op quite heavily wins me games, because people miss that if you can control the crit op, it's better than controlling the kill op. Because if you're just, let's say, for example, your opponent scores 6 on the tac op and you score 4, but then you score like 5 or 6 on the crit op, and then your opponent only scores like 2, that's a bigger swing than the tac op stuff, especially if you pick the crit op as your primary. And then the kill op is still an important tool. Like, don't focus on maxing the kill op, focus on being ahead or tying on the kill op. There are some times, as I said, where if me and my opponent are deadlocked on the crit op and tac op, I'll use the kill op as a way to go ahead or keep myself in the game. Because remember, if your kill grade is 1 higher than your opponent, that's a 2 victory point swing. So it can actually matter quite heavily. And also, if I'm in the lead and my kill grade is tied, or I'm slightly ahead, I'll actually pull back to let my opponent maybe score another point on the crit op, to just go like, and maybe another point on the tac op, because keeping that lead on the kill op is crucial. So I'm not saying the kill op is useless, it's just something you can't rely on. And then, yeah, relying on the crit op, it's really important to focus, and the crit op is actually the easiest way you can deny and control your opponent. And then tac ops come down to your archetype. Tac ops are what you should generally be picking as your primary option, but it does heavily depend. Exactly, for example, confirm kill. Confirm kill is great, but if your opponent doesn't engage you turning point 2, or you can't safely engage them turning point 2, you're actually maybe only getting 4 points from that. And plant beacons is the best, but if you don't have access to recon, and let's say your security and seek and destroy, the crit op's probably a better bet. Or if you're going to be hyper aggressive, you can go the tac op with as your prime with seek and destroy, because when I'm running elites and I'm into like teams I outnumber, I generally go with overrun and put that as my primary, because I can just keep overwhelming my opponent, and you know, they might time me out on the kill op, but eventually I'll win and overrun them. I'll also be controlling the crit op because I'm contesting the objectives. And it's really about engaging and looking at what your opponent's composition is. The key thing when you're looking at your opponent's team, do they outnumber you? Do you outnumber them? Or do you have the same amount of activations? And then you're looking at the board. How open is the board? And where are there rooms for you to stage? Because, for example, secure center is actually really great if you outnumber your opponent and it's a very open board, because then you can run into the middle, last activation, and then when your opponent tries to contest in the future, they're going to have to run into the open when you outnumber them. And another thing is, as I said, confirm kill. It can be really good on paper, but if you're playing on like Gallo Dark, where your opponent can actually be very cagey and not have to commit until turning point 3, confirm kill becomes less useful. So it's really important about not just what tac ops you can pick, it's about what the kill zone you're playing on is and what your opponent is actually running, which may come like basic knowledge to a lot of people, but you'd be surprised how many people forget that. So hopefully this all helped. It is very long, 45 minutes, and I do apologize, but when my guides, I like to be more in depth, try and give a proper breakdown so you do understand and get where I'm coming from. Because, you know, I use these techniques very consistently. I've been using them since I've been playing the new edition about 4-5 months ago. And once again, like my biggest takeaway, you'd be surprised how reliably you can control the crit op or your opponent throws away the crit op. Because I've had a lot of people just go like, oh yeah, I scored 0 on the crit op turning point 2, but I thought I could bring it back. I didn't realize you would just like force me off the objectives, which is huge, especially, you know, when you're running elites. It's beneficial because you can kind of have the durability to tank all that. But there's a lot of teams that can control the crit op also via killing. So if you love smashing people up, you can control the crit op via the kill off, you know? It's like an Ouroboros of crits. It's amazing. But yeah, hopefully this helped. It's a bit long, but that's pretty much it for me today. Please remember to like and subscribe as well as comment. Let me know what you thought today's video. Did you find it useful and helpful with my scoring guide? Is there anything I missed out or anything you find useful? And remember, I've got a Discord you can check out for free in the episode description below, and a affiliate link at Element Games, and a affiliate link and discount code at Crossfire Games, and a Patreon if you want to give me some more support. And I'm just going to quickly shout out my patrons. So for my adjuncts as a crit, I have Tom, Supercow, Sam, Nick, Mercenary Q, Mr. Meatwad, Lucas, Jeremiah, Graham, Fangzu, Draken, Dave Meatsworld, Darcy, Dan, Dad of Goldens, Chris, Amorphium, and then for my veterans of the crit, I have Sam, Joe, and Mark. So thank you all for your support. It really means a lot to me and helps support the channel. But yeah, I am actually planning to get through a ton of guides. I have more time off, so I'm going to like fire through these, and it gives me time because who knows what's happening with the balanced data slate. At least if I talk about core mechanics and tactics, I can use what I've learned from tournaments and events over the past few months, as well as, you know, in general, because I've been playing Kill Team for over 3 years now, and basically using what I've learned to help you improve, because it's a learning process. So the more I share with you, the better I get, because now I have to adapt to that. So sorry about the wait from this. I wanted to finish until LVO. Now I've got ITC out of the way. I'm more open to give away all my secrets and tricks to help people improve. Just because I wanted to hold off just a bit. And I've tested it all. So it works really well. And someone who's now playing a team that has Recon, oh my gosh, Recon is amazing. I spent like 4 months playing Seek and Destroy and Recon. Seek and Destroy and Security. Wow, Recon is amazing. But remember, no matter what happens when it comes to your scoring in Kill Team, there's always a chance for you to win, as long as you can roll a crit.